So, question is, what's going on here? So we have knight versus bishop endgame, 5 pawns, 5 pawns. We got A and B, whoops, A and B, A and B. White has this isolated E pawn, and black has an isolated H pawn. Okay, currently the bishop is kind of out of play. It is targeting its E4 pawn, but white has it well covered. And this knight is centralized, but doesn't really have any great hopping squares at the moment. White's king is better. And so in general, when there are pawns on both sides of the board, usually a bishop is superior. But you have to be careful because the bishop is rather monochromatic. And so it's rather limited as to what it can do, whereas a knight can actually attack every square on the board. So depending on how the pawn structure looks, a knight can often actually outduel a bishop, even in a fairly open position with pawns on both sides of the board. So the question is, what should white do? There are a couple of options. You know, I'm just going to make a random move so I get rid of the colors, but, you know, a move like A5 makes sense to fix these pawns on light squares, and to keep your pawns on dark squares, which makes them unavailable to attack from the bishop. A move like E5 makes sense to fix F7. A move like King F4 makes sense to get the king active. Maybe even King G4 to try to go this way. Maybe even King E3 to try to go this way. A plethora of options. So the question is, which route is best? So does anyone know which way white should play? I mean, also you could consider H4 or G4. or even B4, I suppose. But the question is, which one's better? Or the best? And one of the most important endgame principles is the principle, do not hurry. Now, what exactly does do not hurry mean? Well, it means that you don't want to necessarily rush into something that, you know, seems thematic if you have something you can do first that improves your position, you know? So, for example, if we were to consider just the difference between, say, King F4 and A5, notice that black finds it much tougher to stop King F4 than he does to stop A5. So for example, if we play King F4, black can just play B6, stop A5. And you know, if our king gets in another square, then black can just play King E7 and chase our king away with F6, and then chase our king away further with E5. If he'd like. Whereas if you play A5 first, it's kind of difficult for black to keep our king out of F4 if we so choose, because this move A5 also comes with a threat, and that threat is to play knight A4 and knight C5 and just win this pawn. So this principle of do not hurry would suggest us to play this A5 move. So A5 is definitely correct. A5 is definitely correct. So gold star for anyone who said A5. So now we're threatening knight A4 to knight C5. Okay, so black plays king to E7. Well, what else is he going to do? Okay, so now, what should white play? What should white play? So now if we kind of continue with our plan blindly, knight a4, black can play king d6, and potentially even follow it up with king e5. Then this pawn seems to be rather loose. If this knight goes hopping for this pawn, well then we get forked. So we'd ideally like to keep his king out of d6. But the question is, can we play e5? Whoops. Can we play e5? Because now we're kind of letting his bishop out of jail. And also maybe giving him the opportunity to play f6. And then, kind of by force, black is going to try to get his king to d6. So the question is e5 any good? It makes sense, but does it actually work? And it turns out that e5 is actually correct. So now again we're keeping the king out of d6, and if f6, hope you guys found that the correct move here is simply to play king to f4. And now this king can never be chased away from this square, and if pawn takes, obviously king takes is a crushing advantage. This king is a monster compared to this king. If this king goes this way, this king's gonna go this way, eat this pawn, and these pawns are gonna make touchdowns. So, and if black doesn't do anything, then notice that this is always a threat. If f5, well then he's just putting all of his pawns on light squares and entombing the bishop on h7, which can't be good. And so this threat of this capture always means that this king has to babysit this pawn. And so this is just lost, because again, we're just going to play here. So after e5, black has to try something else. So he plays king d7. Okay, now what? Now what? So now black's kind of trying to meet us at the pass. If we play knight a4, he'll play king c6. And then our knight's kind of stuck. So the question is what to do here. Okay, so in endgames, oftentimes we get to create these nice geometrical patterns. And so notice that when this king comes to c6, it's kind of threatening to invade. So the way we stop that is to play b4. And now notice how we create this wall. This impenetrable wall. So this king is stuck. This king is stuck. We created a little pocket. So the king can step into the pocket, but he can't ever get out. And notice how every single one of our pieces is on a dark square. This guy is just a big ghost. Big ghost. So yeah, b4. And again, if this king strays too far, we're going to play knight a4 and knight c5 again. So black plays king to c6. And now what? So it seems like black's kind of curtailed our queenside play. So now what? Notice how black has a little bit of his own wall. And if we try to go this way, well, black can kind of head us off at the pass. with bishop g6 and construct the third brick of the wall. So the question is, what should white do here after king c6? So there's nothing really left to do other than to somehow start pushing these pawns. So white leads with g4. Doesn't really matter, but g4 is probably slightly more accurate. Just so h5 is not even a possibility. Black plays b6, trying to liquidate these pawns as quickly as possible to get his king into the game. So now, of course, we don't want to allow take, and then this king starts getting super active. So we take. Notice how if we continue with our plan blindly, then after take, king here, all of a sudden this bishop becomes really strong because it can help support this pawn very quickly. And this is the type of position in which a bishop would shine, because a knight is very clumsy in stopping a passed pawn, whereas a bishop is very good at kind of long range stopping a passed pawn. So this would be very strong for black, which is why he has to take. So he took. And now again he can continue with his plan, h4. And now again black is trying to get out of this prison. So if black plays something like king c6, we'll just kind of continue with king f4 with the idea of h5 first, and then g5, and then when he takes, we'll take with the king and then bring our king in and then kind of gobble up everything and promote a pawn. So that's why black tries a5, just to try to get his king out of this prison and maybe try to eventually, whoops, come this way. So again, we don't really have much of a choice. We can't let this sit there, and we can't push, because then this pawn becomes strong again. So we take.
Check.
King takes. And now, what should white play here? Now what should white play here? Whoops. Sorry. We were watching Endgame Master at work to get you guys hyped for this. So now it's time to bring in the cavalry. So the question is, where does this guy want to be? Because he needs to start doing something. He needs to start doing something. So where should he go? So he wants to ideally come here. So the question is, can we allow this trade to happen? And the answer is of course, because after take, king moves anywhere, say here. Now we simply create a passed pawn by force, because we play h5 first, h5 important. If we play g5, then after h5, all of a sudden, it's tricky. King f4, king c4, g6, take, king here, king here, king here, king here, king here, king here. And this is actually probably worse for us. So we don't want to do something like that. But what we can do is after king b5, play h5. And now when the king goes anywhere, we just play g5. And the king cannot reach this square in time. So after take, we play h6, and this pawn promotes. And even if he just tries to run as fast as he can, he's still one tempo short.
Check.
So that doesn't work. So he can't take. So he might as well try to get his king back into the game, so he plays king b4. And now knight to d6. So we're simply threatening this pawn. And the bishop, if it goes to g6, we can play h5 now. And then win this pawn. And then win this pawn. And then that's the game. So black has to play bishop g8. And now we bring our king in, king to b4. And now a little question for you guys. Where should this king go? Where can this king go? So it's actually tricky, because this knight somehow is actually building this invisible wall. So obviously it's controlling this square. But did you know that this knight is also controlling this square and this square? You say, how can that be? That's blasphemous. Well, it turns out that if the king plays king c5 or king c3, we got a fork of a fork. So say king c3, you have knight e4 check, king moves, knight f6. And all of a sudden this bishop is trapped. It's trapped, and we gain the extra tempo with a check. So the king can't actually go here, here, or here. Not to mention that it can't go here. So we've actually built up this wall. Again. So this poor king being walled up all over the place says, alright, king b3, fine. I guess. And now white just finishes the job with h5. Now again, notice the king can't go here. Same idea. So you have to go king c2. And now g5. So we're just threatening to actually play take, followed by this. So for example, if king d3 or something, we take. Then if, I don't know, king d4, we just take here. And he can never take because we promote, and we're just starting to play knight g5 and h7, and that's just the game. So he has to take.
Check.
We take. King d3. He's trying to get his king back, miraculously. King f6. King d4. And now, you know, anything wins, but this is the simplest. Knight takes f7. So if he takes, this pawn is way too fast. I mean, way too fast. And if he doesn't do anything, if he moves his king, say, well, we're just going to play knight g5 check. And then knight takes e6. And again, pretty trivial win. So after king d4, knight takes f7, black resigned. Because he had no chance. So that's how that type of position is one for white. But you have to be careful because, you know, if you rush into things too quickly and you play a move like king f4, you make your task considerably harder after b6. I mean, okay, maybe you can still win, but you increase the difficulty greatly. And so a5 is necessary. And then after king e7, this e5 move to stop king d6. And then here the key is to play b4 and create this wall. And now the problem is we kind of have another very classic endgame principle, which is the endgame, the principle of two weaknesses. And so black's two weaknesses are that he has to always constantly monitor this knight a4 to c5 idea. And his other weakness is that his king side, particularly this pawn. So we just kind of want to go here and here and here and here and here and then get our king in. And unfortunately, black can't stop both ideas. Because, okay, he can stop knight c5, he can put his king on c6. And he can stop this if he could put his king, you know, on g7 or something. But his king, unfortunately, cannot be simultaneously on c6 and g7. And so we win. So that's that example. Let us look at another one. Okay, how about this one? So this one is more classically favoring the knight. But it seems a bit more difficult to determine what to do. Okay. So this one is white to move. What do you guys think? How should white continue? So it seems that white has this great position. He has a better king. All his pawns on the king side are on dark squares, so he has to worry about them. He has his queen side pawns advanced. And his knight can pretty much hop to any square. But the question is, how does white actually break through on the queen side? Because if you notice, black has actually constructed this wall, right? So the question is, how do we get in? So does anyone have an idea for how to get in? Yeah, I mean, the problem is even if this knight does move to the king side, what's it doing? Like, okay, say you teleport this knight to h4. I mean, how does it help you? You still can't break through. Because this side is completely locked. So the question is, what should white do? So someone in the chat suggested knight to d2 with the idea of knight to c4 and putting pressure on these pawns. Okay. Looks good. Looks good. But the problem with this is I can play bishop d3. And now if you play knight c4, I'm going to actually play this move b5. And now, surprisingly enough, you can never win this. You can never win this. The point being that, so, like, the idea is, okay, you want to try to get your knight to d4, right? So, like, knight b3, say. I'm going to play bishop b1, you play knight b3. Okay, actually, you have to play king c3 first. And I play bishop a2. And now I'm hitting this pawn. So you have to go back with your king to d4. And so you never have time to actually get your knight there. So yeah, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. So, I mean, coming up with the plan is good, but you also have to make sure you think of your opponent's responses. So yeah, if he can get his bishop kind of outside the pawn chain, he can harass your knight enough so that you can't actually do anything. And so V7 brought up an interesting point. So can we play a move like c6 with the idea that we just want to play king here and knight here? And the point of this knight to d4 is that we're forking both knight b5 takes c7 and knight e6 takes c7. And his bishop can't really stop both. So, you know, if his bishop's on c8, we just play knight b5 and knight takes c7. If his bishop is on, say, this diagonal somewhere, this diagonal, we play knight d4 takes to e6 and takes c7. So that looks reasonable. But again, if we play c6 immediately, then after bishop d3, king c3, pawn b5, same idea. Knight d4, bishop c4, knight e6, take, and all of a sudden blocks up a pawn. And still has the wall. Still has the wall. And that wall is actually unbreakable. Because this knight is actually trapped, believe it or not. I mean, it can go to d5, I guess, after king d4, but black will just let it sit. So this pesky idea of getting the bishop out to d3 and playing b5, and then harassing this pawn on c4 is annoying, because the king is really the only way that this pawn can be defended. And if our bishop's on c4, then we must keep our king on d4, and if we must keep our king on d4, this knight has no way to kind of enter the position. So the question is what to do. Question is what to do. And so the right idea is to play V-Sim's idea, but in the opposite order. And so we're going to start with king c3. The point being now that if bishop d3, knight d4, if b5, well, now we just have knight e6 right away. And we're just winning. And if pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, well, knight b3. And again, white wins. Because eventually we're just going to take this pawn and our king's going to march up, and it is hopeless. So for example, if like king e7, knight takes pawn, king here, king here. Well, actually, here we can actually play take, and then, oops, Sorry, I mistake. No, sorry, we play here. But yeah, he can't play c6 because we can take and then take. So he has to move his bishop somewhere. But we're just gonna play knight b7 check, and then king e5, and it's hopeless. So that's the trick. So the trick is knowing that this endgame is winning. And if c4 as a try, well, it doesn't really matter because we're still gonna play knight d4. And again, this is a fork. We're forking this, but we're also forking this, and we're also forking this. So if the king moves away from this pawn to try to defend this pawn, we're gonna take this guy.
Check.
And then notice how we control this square, so he has to go back someplace. And then we can either, try to win this guy, or bring our king in, and put him in some sort of zugzwang. But again, white's going to win this, because we have access to d4. So the trick is what happens after king c3, bishop b7. And now the point is revealed because we play c6, bishop c8, and now knight d4, with this idea dual threat. So king e7, only way to defend this, right? And now, dear viewers, tell me, how does white win here? So white actually can't force a zugzwang yet. Because remember, if knight b5, king c8, now this knight no longer attacks this pawn. So this bishop is free to move. This bishop can go to a6. So there is no zugzwang. And if the knight stays here, then my king is free to move. I can move back and forth. So there is no zugzwang with the knight alone. So what is the winning technique? Because again, our king can't get in. There's still a barrier. And our knight can't force the win of material, because as soon as the knight hops to b5, he plays king d8 and bishop a6 and chases it away, then moves it back, etc. So how does white win? So how does white win? Yeah, and trading these guys doesn't win. So knight b5, king d8, knight a7, even if this trade were forced, which it isn't, because I can play here. But even if it were forced, it wouldn't win, because I could just play king b8, king e8 forever. And now this knight's actually trapped. And if you play b5, well, now you've locked yourself in completely. And now this knight's trapped, so you might as well take, and now it's just a draw, because your king can't get in. I have the barrier. So how does white win? How does white win here? So when all else fails, usually the secret involves violent piece sacrifices. So, of course, the simple way to win is just king c4, king b5, knight c2, knight a3, knight c4, and knight takes b6. And after pawn takes, these pawns are too strong. So I'll just show you how it happened. King b3, king a4, king b5. Black really can't do anything. Knight c2, knight a3, knight c4, and finally knight takes b6, king takes b6, And now, of course, if this king doesn't go to d8, we're just going to play king c7 and b5, b6, b7. So king d8, but just b5. And zugzwang. Zugzwang. So now the bishop is stuck. And the king has to go to e7 or e8, and then we play king c7 and b6 and b7 and b8. So black resign. But it's instructive to realize that in that position, the initial position, that there's a difference between playing c6 first and playing king c3 first. Because playing king c6 first allows us shenanigan with bishop d3 and b5. Whereas if we play king c3, now this doesn't work anymore because we're playing knight d4 immediately. And we don't mind sacrificing this pawn temporarily because it means our king gets in, because there's no more fortress. Because this pawn has been removed. And as well as this pawn. So now this pawn is ripe for the taking. So that's a kind of another example of using some zugzwang techniques in addition to some other things. Okay. So I'll do one more example. And this one is super famous. Super ultra famous. See if you guys can figure this one out. Okay, black to move. Black to move. So pawns are going this way. And white pawns are going this way. Okay, so what should black do here? Alright, give you guys a few more minutes to ensure that you solve the problem. So yeah, this is a super famous game. Hopefully not too many of you guys recognized it. I'll tell you why it's famous afterwards, if you don't know, but okay, so it seems like this is kind of another position where the knight should shine, because, you know, the pawns are locked up. You know, these pawns are on the same color as the bishop, these pawns are on the opposite color of the bishop, which means they can't be defended by the bishop. This king is kind of cut off, right? There's a brick wall. So even though, you know, black's king is technically better, there's still a bit of an issue. Okay, so the question is, what should black do here? And the answer is, well, he needs to create some sort of zugzwang. The objective is to create some sort of zugzwang. Yeah. So this endgame position is famous. Yep. And so the right move is to play bishop to b1. So the simple threat is to play bishop a2 and to just gobble these pawns. So bishop b1 is forced, ding, knight to f1. So that's stage 1. So stage 1 is to force knight f1. Because now that this knight's on f1, it's going to have to stay on d2 to defend this pawn. And then we have this idea to bring our king to e6 and play d5 and such. D takes c4, etc. Okay. So bishop c2, forcing knight to d2. Again, you have to keep on this pawn. King e6, king f2, d5, of course. Now you're threatening to take this. And so if you don't, I'll take. And if you take with a knight, I'll just play bishop takes pawn, and win. And if you take with the pawn, I'll play bishop takes a4 and win. So you have to take.
Check.
King takes. King to e3. Okay, so it seems like, how can you make progress here? It seems like, how can you make progress here? So again, the simple trick is a zugzwang trick. So notice that this king has to stay in contact with d4, because he cannot allow king to d4. That would be catastrophic. King d4 and king to c3. But how do we do it? How do we do it? So notice that, like, bishop takes b3 just fails miserably. Knight takes b3, c4, knight takes. So if b3, simply king here. And white is threatening king c3, so you have to go king d4. And now probably the simplest way to win is to just go knight takes pawn.
Check.
Take, and to play a5. So king c5 forced, king here, b2, take, king here, 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 and white wins easily. So you can't sack your bishop. That just loses. That just loses. But yeah, the right answer is bishop to d1. Okay, so now it's kind of zugzwang, right? This knight can't move, right? Because it has to defend b3. But okay, what happens on king d3? What happens on king d3? Because now I'm stopping king d4, and now your bishop is kind of stuck, right? I mean, you know, it can't really go this way, and it doesn't really want to go this way. So it seems like you're in Zugzwang now yourself. Ah, but the tactical tricks. Bishop takes b3, knight takes b3, c4,
check.
And now it's over. Because now we don't even sacrifice. It's just, we win material. Well, we have a 1 king and pawn ending. So yeah, king c2,
check.
Take king d4. And if you ever try g4, you're too slow. Take g3, g2, g1. And funnily enough,
checkmate.
That's actually checkmate. It's actually checkmate. But you have to be careful. You have to be a little bit careful, because let me just show you one other thing. If you take the other way, if you take this way, notice what happens. Notice what happens.
Check.
Check. So you have to be a little careful which way you take. You might not think it matters, but it does. But it's very cute that you actually get a checkmate.
Checkmate.
So yeah, if white doesn't do this, of course, then he has to play, you know, king somewhere. And now, of course, this king goes this way. Not this way, but this way. Because you'd have to be careful about this queening thing, but it's just trivial if you go this way. Actually, even king e4 is probably the safer route. Because now g4 you just take this way, and it's completely hopeless. And this king can never get around, because as soon as this king gets to b5, you just play b3, b2. So king e4 and king f3 just win. So black just resigned, or sorry, white just resigned after bishop takes b3, because it's hopeless. Because, okay, if he can't take, then he's losing this pawn, and 3 connected passed pawns are going to be good. It's going to be good. And so yeah, bishop e1 was the key. Yeah, this is a very, very fine endgame technique. And the reason this game was famous was because this was played in Linares in 1991, and white was venerable former world champion, still super strong player Anatoly Karpov. And black was some nobody Indian kid named Vishwanthan Anand, who no one had ever heard of before. And after winning this fantastic game against Karpov, people started to hear of him a little bit more. So yeah, this was the game Karpov Anand from Linares 91. So, yeah. So I mean, most chess players have actually seen this before. It's quite a famous